In this video, we'll talk more about CSS. We'll start with pseudo-class selectors and how to combine selectors in various ways. In the last lecture, we talked about CSS class selectors, where you put a dot in front of a class name to select all the elements that have that class. Well, here you are going to use two dots, in other words, a column in front of a keyword to select all the elements that are in certain state. The best example of an element in different states is probably the hyperlink element. So I have an example here. This is a simple HTML page. I have a div on top that has an ID menu one, and inside there are two hyperlinks. And after that, I have a level 2 heading, a table, and a couple of div elements. And this is what it looks like. So notice that we have two links here, and right now they are both blue, and both of them are, of course, anchor elements. And if I click on one of those links and then come back, notice that this link has become purple, indicating that I have already visited this link. And this is a good example of the same elements, but in different states. They are still the same anchor elements, but one is in a so-called link state, meaning that it's not visited, and this one is in the visited state, so it has a different styling. Now, in CSS, you can make up your own class names, but all the pseudo class names are predefined. The most commonly used are the ones for the anchor element or for the hyperlink element. Link, indicating that the link is unvisited, and visited is the visited state. The link has been visited. Hover, when you mouse over a link, and active. So active is a state that you probably didn't really notice. So when you try to click on a link, so I'm going to press my mouse button here. Notice that when you press your mouse button, but before you release it, this link is in the so-called active state, where it actually shows red. And then when you release the mouse button, it will go to that linked page. Besides the pseudo classes for hyperlinks, there are a few additional ones that let you pick out elements. If, for example, they are first of the type, last of the type, if they are the first child, last child, and so on and so forth. You can find more about pseudo classes and other pseudo classes in the linked document. Arguably, the most common usage of pseudo classes is to style hyperlinks. Although the default styling of blue and purple is pretty effective, people just love to style links differently. For example, if we go to the Cal State LA websites, you can see that all the links in the top menu are actually hyperlinks. You can click on them. However, they don't look blue and purple. They are white, and when you mouse over it, there's an animation effect, and if you click on a link and then come back, they don't change color. So this is pretty common. Many websites style the links, and we can do something like this too, fairly easily using pseudo classes. So let's see how we can do something like this. Again, currently my web page looks like this. There's no styling, but I do have a CSS file here, which is currently empty. And let's add some styling to it. So when we try to style links, we need to follow the LV HA order, meaning that we have to specify the linked state first, and then the visited, and then hover, and then active, following that order. So let's say first we want to make our link white, like was in the menu of the Cal State LA website. So we'll say, let's pick the anchor elements, and if they are in the link state, we want to make the color white. And if we come back and notice that this email link actually became white, but not this manual links. And if we look at the source code, we can see that we have another anchor link here, which links to the email of a person. And by setting this property, we actually made that link white, and now we can't even see it. And these links are not white because they are not in the link state, they are in the visited state, right? And so let's make this white as well, since that's how the university website looks. So we want to say if it's in the link state or if it's in the visited state, they should both be white. And if we come back, we can see that those links disappear too, because now they are white, right? And to see them again, we'll have to make the background black. So let's do that. And notice that for the menu, I'm using a div with an ID menu 1. So we know that we can use a ID selector to select that, and then we can say background color, and let's make it black. And now we can see these two links. And let's say we also want to do a mouse over effect, something like this, but the animation is quite a bit harder to do, so we won't do the animation, but we want to have a mouse over effect. So that means if I mouse over a link, I want to change it color. Let's say we change it to gold, which is our school color. So we'll do something like a hover, and if we mouse over it, we'll make it gold. So if I refresh and mouse over, so notice that now it's gold. So this is how we can style hyperlinks. And we can also try a few other pseudo classes like first of type, last of type, and so on. So let's see what we have in this example. I have three divs. I have three divs. Okay, so let's say if I change that one to div, then all the div elements will have background color. And if I want to change this to first of type, meaning that we only want to set the background color of the first div, then now only the first div gets the background color. And what else? Last of type, first child, last child. Okay, so let's see whether we have any first child, last child. So we do have two rows. So let's see if I set tr to background color, let's say yellow. So both rows now have yellow background. By the way, you can see now we can see the email link here. And if I say I don't want to set all of them, I only want to set first child, and only the first row gets the background color because only the first row is a first child. So this is basically how you can use pseudo classes. More often than not, they are not used by themselves. You combine them with other selectors, which takes us to our next subject, how do we combine selectors? In the last lecture, we already saw two ways to combine selectors. We can concatenate two selectors together, and this will select the elements that match both selectors. In fact, this is exactly what we have been doing here, right? We are combining two selectors, tag name selector or element name selector, and pseudo class selector. Same thing for here, same thing for here and here. And the second way to combine them is to put them together and separated by commas, and in this case it will match any element who match either selector, and this in fact is what we are doing here. So if an anchor element is either in the link state or in the visited state, they will get selected and the style will be applied to them. And then there are some additional ways to put selectors together, separated by space, a right bracket, a plus, and a tilde. They mean that we want to select the elements that match B, that are descendants, direct children, next siblings, or siblings of elements that match A. Of course, to understand what all those means, we first need to understand what descendant, child, and the sibling means. The first thing we need to understand is that the structure of an HTML page is actually a hierarchical one. Take this one, for example. Note that the HTML element is the top element. It contains everything else, and it has two direct children, head and body, head and body, and head and body each has their own children. For example, head has one child title, and body has two children, H1 and P. The text content of an element is also considered its child. Like, for example, HTML example is considered a child of H1. So in this hierarchical structure, or from a computer science perspective, a tree-like structure, you have HTML example underneath H1. So if you look at the HTML document at this hierarchical structure, you can see that it's natural to use terms like parent, child, sibling, ancestor, descendant to describe the relationship between two elements. So knowing what we know, let's look at some examples. So the first example is this. Notice that for the links in the menu, we want them to be white, but any links outside the menu should be regular links, because otherwise, as we can see here, we cannot even see them anymore. So a simple and good way to do it is to use a selector like this or a selector like this. Basically meaning that we only want to select a certain element if it's a child or a descendant of another element. So here, what we want to do is we want to only select the anchor elements if they are the children or the manual element. So we could change this to something like this. We can say manual 1 direct child A and manual 1 direct child and manual 1 direct child, basically saying that if only the A element is a direct child of element that has an ID manual 1, then we select them. If we do that, we can see that here these two links are still selected with the new styles, but this link is not selected and it has a default style. And we can change this to space, and it shouldn't make any difference, because the difference is simply whether B is a direct child or whether B is a descendant. In our example, either way, they will only these two elements will be selected. So changing bracket to space doesn't really change anything. Then let's try also plus and tilde. So plus means we want to select an element if it's the next sibling of another element. So let's try this. I'll do a div plus div, and then I'll make the background, let's say, green. So notice that here in our example, we have 3 divs. We have one div, and then second one here, and the third one here. They are all at the same level, so they are siblings, but they are not necessarily direct sibling or next sibling. So if I do something like this, let's see which one becomes green. Only this one becomes green, right? And that's because only this div is a direct sibling of another div. Now this div is not a direct sibling of this div because there are a few additional siblings between them. Now if I change this to tilde, now both of these divs become green because both of them are among the next siblings of another one. Right? So this one is among the sibling of this one, and this one, of course, is among the sibling of both this one and this one. So both of these are green, but this one is not among the next sibling of any div. So this one is not affected. So this is how we can combine selectors, and then let's talk about the second important thing of today, the CSS Box Model. In CSS, each element is represented as a rectangular box that consists of several layers: content, padding, border, and margin. This is how it looks like visually. The content is at the center and has a width and height. There could be a border around the content. Here, for demonstrative purpose, I'm drawing a very thick border. In fact, all the gray area is a border. Of course, in practice, borders are usually much thinner, but CSS does allow you to specify border width. So if you want a very thick border like this, you can. There are two commonly adjusted properties: padding and margin. Notice that padding is the space between content and border, and the margin is the space outside the border. In other words, padding controls the spacing within the element, and the margin controls the spacing between elements. Let's start with the CSS properties for borders. After we set a border, it will be a lot easier to see the effects of the other properties. For border, we can set width, style, and color, and like for fonts, we can either set them separately using border width, border style, border color properties, or using one property border. So let's look at an example. So I'm going to get rid of this so it's easier to see borders. And let's put a border between around all the divs. So let's see, we'll do a div and then border, and we'll say 1 pixel solid black. So this will create a border that is 1 pixel white. It's going to be a solid border, meaning the style of the border will be solid, and it's going to be black colored. So now we have a border here and here. In fact, there's also a border on the menu div, but because the background is black, we cannot really see it, but that's okay. So this is how a regular border looks like. You can use the 3 properties to control it, and let's try another style. So for example, if you want a dashed style, you can see that the border becomes a dashed border. And if you want, let's say, a double border, you'll see that it still looks kind of like a solid border, and that's because our border width is only 1 pixel. If you need a double border, it should be at least 3 pixels so that it can show 2 borders plus the space between the 2 borders. So something like this. If you increase the width, it becomes easier to see. So this is how we can set some borders. And now let's talk a little bit more about the units we use. We are using pixels here or px here to set border width. And we have also seen the usage of units like pt for point and em when we set font sizes. There are other units like vh and vw representing the percentage of the viewport, and you can find more about different CSS units in the linked document. A common question is that out of all these possible units, which one should I use? The general recommendation is that if you can use a relative unit, like em for font sizes, then use a relative unit. Otherwise, use px, pixels. You may think that pixel is a bad unit to use because different screens have very different resolutions and pixel densities. But actually, pixel is a good unit to use. This is because these days, devices distinguish between hardware pixels and software pixels, or the CSS pixels. Hardware pixels are the real pixels. We'll read about the resolution of a screen, like 1080p or a 4K screen. Those refer to the hardware pixels. The CSS pixels are designed by software to look roughly the same size on different screens, so it's actually a good unit to use if you want your website to look nice on different devices. In addition to specify a full border, you can specify something only have part of a border, like only have a border on top or at the bottom, and so on. In fact, you can control the width, style, and the color of the 4 sides individually. For example, instead of a full border, we could say border bottom. And it will create a bottom border for the two divs. And or we can do, let's say, border top style solid. And now we have a border at the bottom and also a top border. And we can of course say border top color should be red, and we'll have a red top border and black double bottom border. And we can also create borders with rounded corners. So, for example, let's get rid of this and just start with a border 1 pixel solid black. So it looks like this, and then we can say border radius. Let's give it a 5 pixel radius. So probably a little bit hard to see, but if you look at the corners, you can see that the corners are rounded. And in fact, those corners can be controlled individually. And you can, instead of specifying the same radius for all 4 corners, you can specify radius for top left, top right, bottom right, bottom left. So the first value would be top right, and then it goes counterclockwise. So for example, we can specify 4 values, 5, 10, 15, and 20. And you can see that it starts as a top left corner with a radius of 5 pixels, and then it becomes 10 pixels on the top right, and then 15 pixels at the bottom right, and 20 pixels at the bottom left. Creating borders with rounded corners used to be pretty difficult because different browsers use different properties and different syntax. But now it's standardized and it's pretty easy. Borders for most elements are pretty straightforward, but for tables, they're a little bit different. This is because a table involves usually several different types of elements. You would have at least T table and the TR and TD, and often you'll also have T head and T body. By default, table uses the so-called separating model. Let's take a look what it looks like. So I have a table here, and so let me change this one back to regular border so it becomes less distracting. So let's say we want to add a border to table, which we have one here. We have a table with a T-body, a couple of rows, and a header cell, and then a regular cell or data cell. And it looks like this. So let's say we want borders for the table. So naturally, the first thing we would want to try is put a border on the table element. So if you do that, the first thing you'll notice is that it only puts a border around the table, but not inside. And this, of course, is because notice that a table element is just that, and everything inside are different elements. So if you want additional borders inside, you have to put them around the cells. So let's do that, and we'll say I want a border around TH and TD as well. So we'll say 1 pixel solid black. And now we have this. So this, as I mentioned, is known as a separated model for tables, and this is a default model people use to set borders. And under this model, first you need to set borders on individual cells, and then you cannot set borders on the TR element. And also notice that there's gap between cell borders. So there are individual cells, and we'll put borders on individual cells. There's a default gap in there. I guess that's why it's called the separated model. All the cells are separated. So more often than not, if you actually want to set a border on a table, you would want to use a so-called collapsed model. This will collapse all the borders and make them continuous. So the property is called border collapse, and you need to put that on the table. And now notice that all the borders becomes continuous, or in other words, they collapse. In this model, you still need to put borders on individual cells because, again, table is the thing that around everything, but inside, if you want inside borders, you still need to put borders on individual cells. But at least now they are continuous. Also, in this model, you can set a border on table row if you want. Now that we know all about borders, let's talk about width and height. Just like other measures in CSS, you can use absolute units like pixels and relative units like percentage of viewport width and viewport height. So let's use one of these diffs as an example. So the first diff has a class text1, and the second one has a class of text2. So let's select text2. Now, first I'm going to say, so I'm going to select text2, and it is a class, so I'm going to use a class selector, and let's set a width on it. And let's say width is 50%. So now you can see that this element or this div only takes half of the screen width. And I can of course also use absolute unit. Let's say we want 200 pixels, for example, and this becomes like this. 50% is probably better. Again, when you can use relative so that it can be automatically adjusted when the screen size changes. So in addition to, let's also set a height. So height, how much height do we want to set? So there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rows, and so if I set 6 EM, so it will be probably taller than it. Let's say 8 EM. Okay, so now it's significantly taller. So in addition to width and height, there are other properties like minimum width, maximum width, minimum height, maximum height, and so on. So you can use to, set the minimum and max of the dimensions. One thing I want to mention is that the width and height properties only work on block elements. So div, of course, is a block element. But if you try it on an inline element, it won't work. So, for example, this span element. If you say span, and if you say width is like 100 pixels, it doesn't do anything because span is an inline element. If you do want to set width and height on an inline element, you need to specify the display property of that element to be inline block. Basically, make that inline element that behave like a block element. So we can say display is inline block. And now you can see that this one has a width now. And just to show it more clearly, we can put a border around it so that you can see now it has a width. And if we increase this, the width increases, and you can also set the height if you want. So inline elements, block elements, they behave differently. Keep that in mind, and also know which common elements are block and which common elements are inline. For margin and padding, once you understand what they are in the CSS box model, it's very easy to adjust them. For example, let's say I want to increase the margin between this two div blocks. So I can say, what can I say? So let's say I add let's say I add margin to the first div block. I'll say margin 2em. So roughly 2 characters. Looks like more than 2 characters, but you get the idea. So now you can see that there's a 2em margin around this block, and that adds the spacing between this block and the elements around it. So we could also increase padding. So notice that margin increase the spacing outside the element, but the text inside still look pretty close to the border. So we can also add a little bit padding. Let's say add 5 pixels padding. And this increases the spacing within the block. And if we want, we can also set margins and paddings on individual sides. You can either set it using one property. So let's say if I give it two values, let's say I want top and bottom margin to be 10 pixels and the left and right margin to be 2 pixels. So you can see that there's a bigger margin on top and bottom, but smaller ones on the side. And I can also, for example, simply specify a particular side. I can say, what do I want to say? So let's say I want top padding to be increased for the second block. So I can say padding top increase to 15 pixels, and so the padding on top is increased, but the padding on left and right and bottom are not. So you can use margin dash side or padding dash side to set the padding and margin on a particular site, and possible values are top, bottom, left, and right. Now, speaking of top and bottom margins, so when browsers arrange elements on a web page, sometimes it will combine the top and bottom margins of adjacent blocks into one margin. This is called margin collapsing. So don't be surprised if you have two blocks, each having their own margin, but the space between them is not the sum of the two. If that happens, it's not because your CSS is wrong, it's simply because the browser is doing something called margin collapsing. So this video is mainly about selectors and the CSS box model, but I'm going to throw background in here as well because there's no other good place to put it. So we have seen background color, like for the manual one, and it's simply background color. We can also use an image for background, and there are a few properties that we can control to we can use to control how the background image is displayed. So let me first put a background image in here. Let's say I put the background image on the body, so it will show the whole page, show in the whole page. So I'm going to put it on the body element, and it's going to have a background image, and the URL will be this one. I have a image here called texture. It's basically like a old paper type of texture, yellow-ish with some wrinkles and stuff. So the URL is, how do I specify URL? Okay, so the URL is texture.jpg, so it's going to be texture.jpg. And notice that I'm putting the background image on the body element, or on this element, so it should cover the whole page. Okay. So this is how it looks like. Doesn't look as nice as I would have wanted. It's not like a continuous texture, but that's okay. It's just an example. So notice that the texture background is actually a very small image. I think it's like 16 pixel by 16 pixel or 64 by 64. In any case, it's definitely not large enough to cover the whole page, right? But it does cover the whole page, and you can kind of tell that that's because the browser have repeatedly applied this background image, so everything is covered. And that's one of the properties that you can use to control how background image is displayed. That's background repeat. By default, you can see that it's repeated in both X and Y directions. But if you want, you can change it to something, for example, background repeat, just repeat in Y direction or vertically, and you can see that it's only repeating vertically. Or you can say it's not repeated at all, and it will be no repeat. So you can say no repeat. And in this case, it only covers a little bit of the page. There are a few others, like background position. By default, it's start at the top left, but you can also place it in center or bottom and a few other positions. And you can use background attachment to control whether the background scrolls with the page or not. So if I'm scrolling this page, let's make it smaller. Not this. So if I scroll this page, you can see that the background image disappears. But if I say background attachment fixed, now you can see that this background image is like attached to a certain position in the screen, in the page, and it doesn't scroll with the rest of the page. And like many other properties, you can specify those individually or put it all in the same background property. So, all right, this is the end of this video. See you in the next one.